Rome had fallen, or so the world would later say. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed, leaving crumbling ruins across Italy, Gaul, and Spain. But Rome never truly died. It simply lived on in another form, in another city, beneath another name. This was Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, a state that would outlast the West by nearly 1,000 years. To understand its rise, we must return to the early 4th century, when an emperor named Constantine looked eastward and saw the future. Constantine the Great is remembered as one of Rome's pivotal rulers. Emerging as sole emperor after years of civil wars, he was determined to unite, stabilize, and transform an empire that seemed too vast, too weary, to be ruled from a single center. Rome itself, the eternal city, was still grand, but it no longer commanded the empire in economic or strategic terms. The East, with its fertile lands, its wealthy provinces, and its growing cities, had become the true heart of Roman power. Egypt offered grain, Syria and Anatolia produced taxes and trade, and the frontiers of Asia Minor were always under shadow from Persia. Constantine saw that Rome's destiny lay to the east. In 330 AD, he founded a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium, a modest Greek colony on the Bosporus Strait. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, though most soon knew it as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The location was genius. Nestled between Europe and Asia, with natural harbors and easily defensible walls, it straddled the greatest crossroads of trade in the known world. Grain ships from Egypt, silks from China, spices from India, and furs from the Slavic north, all converged on this single point. Its geography promised both prosperity and security. But Constantine's new capital was more than geography. It was an ideological act. He envisioned Constantinople as the continuation of Rome, infused now with Christian identity. The emperor himself had legalized Christianity only decades earlier, ending centuries of persecution. Now, churches dotted the new capital alongside forums, palaces, and baths. It was Rome reborn, infused with both imperial grandeur and new faith. Where old Rome had been built on 7 hills, chroniclers said, so too was New Rome. Constantine adorned his city with treasures taken from across the empire, statues re-erected from Athens and Ephesus, obelisks shipped from Egypt, and forums modeled after the grandeur of Rome itself. For centuries, historians debated, was Byzantium truly Roman? The answer for its people was an emphatic yes. They called themselves Romans, their emperors ruled in the tradition of Augustus and Diocletian, and their laws echoed Justinian and Cicero. But culturally, this Rome was changing. Its language was increasingly Greek rather than Latin. Its faith was Christian rather than pagan. Its neighbors were Persians and Arabs rather than Gauls and Germans. It was both Rome continued and Rome transformed. The survival of the empire after the 5th century confirmed that Constantine's gamble had worked. When the western half crumbled under barbarian invasions, Constantinople endured. After Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the western prestige fractured. After Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, the last emperor of the West became a footnote. But Constantinople still glittered, protected by thick walls and prosperous trade. In an age when the western provinces slipped into feudal kingdoms, the East's capital became the beating heart of civilization. If Rome had once been eternal, it was Constantinople now that wore that mantle. Yet survival was not only about walls and coin. Great figures rose to stabilize these fragile centuries. Theodosius I, reigning in the late 4th century, cemented Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Pagan worship was outlawed, temples shuttered, and the power of the new church fused with the authority of the state. This alignment, new and bold, distinguished Byzantium from its western sibling. It was an empire not merely of armies and administrators, but of saints and bishops, its ideology married to faith. After Theodosius' death in 395, the empire was formally divided. Sons ruled east and west separately. The east, wealthier and more urbanized, fared better. Its armies had the resources to defend its frontiers. Its cities collected taxes that filled the imperial treasury. Constantinople, its walls triple-layered and its harbors buzzing with fleets, was virtually impregnable. Time and again, over the next millennium, it would face sieges, only to repel them with brilliance and resilience. The West would fall, but the East would endure. But consolidation did not mean safety. In these early centuries, Constantinople was both prize and target. Successors to Constantine battled civil wars, talentless emperors squandered resources, and enemies pressed from all sides. Huns lunged across the Danube, Persians tested the eastern frontier, and internal usurpers threatened to split the empire anew. It was a gyrating, unstable crucible. Yet unlike the fragile Western Empire, the East survived these trials. Its bureaucracy was more disciplined, its leaders more pragmatic in diplomacy, bribing barbarians, buying allies, and turning enemies against each other. Trade, wealth, diplomacy, and an urban economy gave Byzantium tools that Italy, Gaul, and Spain no longer possessed. By the early 6th century, Byzantine emperors felt strong enough not only to defend their lands but to dream of reconquest. It was an astonishing reversal of fate. Only a lifetime earlier, Rome had seemed lost forever. Now, under the reign of one titan, the Eastern Roman Empire prepared to strike back against the chaos that had torn down its sibling. That man was Justinian I, the emperor whose ambition would attempt to restore Rome itself. When Justinian I took the throne of the Byzantine Empire in 527 AD, he was not content with mere survival. He was one of the most ambitious rulers in history, a man who viewed Constantinople not as a fortress retreat of a shrinking empire, but as the seat of a universal Roman power waiting to be restored. To his subjects, he was emperor of the Romans, heir to Augustus and Constantine. Yet by Justinian's time, the map told a humbler story. The West had been overrun. Italy belonged to the Ostrogoths, Spain divided between Visigoths and Suebi, and all of North Africa controlled by the Vandals. To dream of reclaiming such land seemed folly, but Justinian was a man who dreamed in marble and blood. From the start, Justinian radiated energy. Born in 482 AD in the Balkans, he was not a product of Rome's old aristocracy. He was the nephew of Emperor Justin I, a former peasant and soldier who had risen through merit in the army. It was through ability and determination, not noble birth, that Justinian reached the throne. This outsider's perspective gave him both an iron will and a restless drive to reshape the empire into something greater than it had been in centuries. He understood that glory rested on more than conquest. Justinian's reign pursued three monumental projects: legal reform, spiritual renewal, and territorial restoration. His legacy in law remains unmatched. Roman law, after centuries of decrees, edicts, and rulings, had become a chaotic jungle of contradictions. Justinian's answer was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law. Compiled by jurists like Tribonian, this immense work gathered and streamlined centuries of legislation into a coherent system. With careful revision, the laws of the empire were crystallized into four great books: the Institutes, Digest, Codex, and Novels. Though Justinian's empire would fade, his code endured, resurfacing in the Middle Ages to form the backbone of European legal tradition. Even today, modern civil law reaches back to Justinian's compilations for its roots. Equally ambitious was his devotion to religion. For Justinian, the strength of the empire was tightly bound to the will of God. His reign was marked by unceasing efforts to unify the empire under Christian orthodoxy, often brutally. He persecuted pagans and heretics, closed academies of philosophy, and pushed dogma aimed to cement the church's power under the imperial crown. Whether one views him as devout or fanatical, his construction projects remain magnificent monuments to his vision. Above all towers Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom. Built after the Nika riots had burned its predecessor, this colossal basilica became the spiritual heart of Byzantium, a domed wonder that still inspires awe today. Its dome, seemingly floating on light-filled windows, was described by contemporaries as a miracle in stone, a church as vast as the sky itself. But Justinian's ambitions extended well beyond Constantinople's walls. He dreamed of restoring the empire of old, restitching the Mediterranean world under Roman rule. For this, he relied on one of the greatest generals in history, Belisarius. Belisarius, loyal and brilliant, first led armies against the Persians in the east, earning his emperor's confidence. Soon, his true test came in the west. In 533, Justinian launched the Vandalic War, sending Belisarius to North Africa with a modest force. The Vandals, who had haunted Roman memory for their sack of Rome in 455, were swiftly broken in battle. Carthage, the jewel of North Africa, fell easily. Within months, an entire kingdom collapsed, its territories once again under imperial banners. For Justinian, it was vindication. The dream was possible. Next came Italy. In 535, Belisarius invaded the Ostrogothic kingdom, a campaign that would stretch nearly 20 years. He captured Sicily swiftly and marched north, eventually entering Rome itself. For the first time in decades, the Eternal City bowed again to a Roman emperor's rule. The war dragged on, brutal and devastating, but at its peak Byzantium controlled much of the peninsula. Italy, cradle of Rome, seemed restored. Even Spain, fractured among Visigoth rulers, saw incursions of Byzantine power. By the mid-6th century, the Mediterranean once again glittered with imperial provinces, North Africa secured, Italy largely pacified, and slices of Spain under Roman authority. Justinian could dare to claim he had rebuilt the Roman Sea, the Mare Nostrum, our sea. For a flickering moment, his empire stretched more broadly than at any time since the ancient Caesars. Yet conquest came at severe cost. Wars drained the treasury. Armies, stretched thin across continents, could not garrison every frontier. Belisarius himself was repeatedly recalled to Constantinople, his campaigns undermined by jealous courtiers and political rivals who feared his fame. And while armies marched west, disasters erupted elsewhere. In the east, war with Persia flared again, pulling scarce resources. At home, Constantinople itself was nearly lost in 532 during the Nika riots. Chariot racing had long been a passion in the capital, its rival factions, blues and greens, more like gangs than sports teams. When tensions boiled, rioters rampaged, burning swaths of the city. For days, Justinian considered fleeing. But Theodora, his formidable empress, famously declared, "The purple is the noblest shroud." Her courage stiffened his resolve. Belisarius stormed into the hippodrome with troops, massacring tens of thousands. Order prevailed, but at a terrible price. Out of the ashes rose Hagia Sophia, the greatest symbol of Justinian's will. Even greater and darker was the disaster of the plague of Justinian. Around 541, a deadly pandemic later identified as bubonic plague swept across the empire. Constantinople was struck cruelly. Contemporary accounts describe tens of thousands dying, corpses carted in heaps to mass graves. At its peak, perhaps half the population perished. With commerce strangled, fields unworked, and armies depleted, the empire staggered. Expansion slowed, stability frayed. By Justinian's death in 565, the empire stood at its territorial height. Hagia Sophia soared, North Africa and Italy once more Roman, and his law code immortalized. Yet the cost of his ambition was clear. Exhausted by continuous war, drained by plague, and dependent on fragile unity, Byzantium was more vulnerable than it appeared. His dream of restoration had dazzled, but it came at the cost of overextension. His successors would inherit not a reborn Rome, but an empire powerful yet precarious. For 2 centuries, Byzantium would struggle to hold Justinian's conquests. Piece by piece, much of Italy would slip away. Spain would be lost. Challenges would mount from new faiths rising beyond its borders. The empire had touched glory, but it had overreached. Still, even its decline was remarkable. The fact that it endured at all was a testament to Constantine's vision and Justinian's will. For centuries more, emperors would walk beneath Hagia Sophia's dome and speak of restoring empire. Yet for all their ambition, none would quite match Justinian's dream, the last emperor who nearly stitched Rome back together. By the mid-6th century, under Justinian, Byzantium had reached dazzling heights. Hagia Sophia crowned Constantinople, Roman law had been codified, and North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain flew again under imperial banners. It seemed for a fleeting moment that Rome had returned, but fate was not so generous. The very brilliance of Justinian's reign drained the empire's reserves. War, plague, and overreach left Byzantium exposed. And in the centuries that followed, wave after wave of crisis would batter at its gates. Where the Western Roman Empire had collapsed within centuries of Augustus, the Eastern would endure, somehow surviving storms that might have obliterated any other state. The first storm blew in from the east. Byzantium's ancient rival, Persia, under the Sassanid dynasty, launched war after war along the empire's eastern frontiers. By the early 7th century, Emperor Heraclius inherited a realm on the brink. The Persians had seized Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. The Holy Cross of Christ was carried off to Ctesiphon as a prize of war. Constantinople trembled. It looked as though the old drama of East versus East would finally end with Byzantium's defeat. But Heraclius refused despair. In a daring campaign in the 620s, he struck deep into Persian territory, defeating them at Nineveh. Astonishingly, the balance turned and Byzantium clawed back its heartlands. The empire seemed restored. Victory celebrations filled Constantinople, yet this triumph would prove tragically brief. For almost simultaneously, a new storm had risen from the Arabian deserts, a force that neither Rome nor Persia could have predicted. The explosive rise of Islam in the 7th century reshaped the world forever. Arab armies, united under the banner of the Prophet Muhammad and his successors, surged out of Arabia with breathtaking speed. Within years, they had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, lands that had been pillars of Roman wealth for centuries. Byzantium, already exhausted from war with Persia, could not stop the flood. In less than a generation, much of the empire's richest provinces were gone. The loss of Egypt in particular was catastrophic. Egypt had been Rome's breadbasket since the time of Augustus, shipping tons of grain annually to feed Constantinople. Without it, the empire faced shortages, economic crisis, and dependence on more precarious supply lines. The taxes, the manpower, the trade wealth all lost. Byzantium shrank dramatically. By the late 7th century, it was no longer a Mediterranean-spanning empire, but a beleaguered state clinging to Anatolia, the Balkans, and a few coastal footholds. And yet against the odds, Byzantium endured. At its heart was the impregnable city of Constantinople. Twice in this period, Arab armies laid siege to the capital, once in the 670s and again in 717–718. The city seemed doomed. Swarming enemy fleets blockaded the Bosporus. Armies camped outside the Theodosian walls. But Constantinople had two extraordinary allies. Its walls themselves, triple-layered and nearly unbreachable, and the terrifying new Byzantine weapon known only as Greek fire. Greek fire was a mysterious incendiary mixture projected from tubes mounted on Byzantine ships. When ignited, it clung to the surface of the sea, burning with such intensity that water could not extinguish it. Enemy fleets, engulfed in sheets of flame, panicked and fled. To this day, the formula of Greek fire remains uncertain, a secret so closely guarded it vanished with Byzantium itself. But in the 7th and 8th centuries, it was the empire's miracle weapon, allowing a weakened state to repel enemies it had no right to defeat. If Arab armies and fleets threatened Byzantium from without, turmoil split it from within. From the 8th century onwards, Byzantium was torn apart by the iconoclasm controversy. For generations, Christians had used images, icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints as focal points of devotion. but emperors and bishops, influenced perhaps by the aniconic traditions of Islam and Judaism, declared them idolatrous. Starting under Emperor Leo III in 726, the imperial government ordered the destruction of icons. Mosaics of Christ were smashed, frescoes of the Virgin whitewashed, and monasteries that defended icons stripped of wealth or worse. The empire fractured along spiritual lines. Regions like Anatolia largely accepted iconoclasm, while Greece and Constantinople resisted, clinging to icons as symbols of true faith. The controversy ripped apart communities, undermined religious unity, and weakened the empire's moral authority. Wars over images might strike modern minds as trivial, but in Byzantium, religion was state. Whether icons stood or fell could determine the legitimacy of an emperor. For over a century, emperors rose and fell in the tide of this ideological war. By the late 9th century, after the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and later reinforcement under Empress Theodora in 843, icons were restored. Orthodox tradition had triumphed, but the scars of division weakened Byzantium just as enemies watched hungrily. Despite its troubles, Constantinople remained magnificent. Travelers in these centuries described walls bristling with towers, markets bursting with spices and silks, and churches glittering with mosaics. It was vastly smaller now than the empire of Justinian, but still an envy of the world. Diplomats from the Franks, Slavs, and even distant lands came to marvel at its riches. To them, the city embodied the survival not of just a state, but a civilization. Byzantium in the 600s-800s had become a paradox, fragile yet stubborn, vulnerable yet enduring. It had lost its heartlands but retained its soul. The same forces that destroyed the Western Empire, invasion, economic collapse, fragmentation, struck the East too. And yet Constantinople stood, walls unbroken, its emperors still calling themselves Basilius of the Romans. The loss of provinces had forced Byzantium to adapt. Gone were sprawling Mediterranean dominions. What emerged instead was a leaner, tougher empire focused on Anatolia and the Balkans, organized through the theme system, districts combining military and civil authority that allowed rapid defense. This structure, born of desperation, ironically stabilized the empire for centuries. By the dawn of the 9th century, Byzantium was no longer the empire of Justinian's dreams. It had been hammered by Persia, humiliated by Arab conquests, torn by icon battles. Yet survivorship was itself a kind of victory. Where others collapsed, Persia annihilated, Visigothic Spain conquered, the caliphates rising and falling, Byzantium proved immortal in endurance. This resilience set the stage for a renewed flowering. As storms subsided, Byzantium would rise once more to power and prestige. A new dynasty would revitalize its army, its culture, and its glory. The time of the Macedonians was dawning, a renaissance of Byzantine brilliance. But for now, as the 9th century opened, the empire's greatest achievement was not conquest but survival. Against all odds, Byzantium still lived. If the 7th and 8th centuries for Byzantium had been an age of survival, the 9th and 10th unfolded as an age of rebirth. Out of the exhaustion of wars and the bitter iconoclast controversy, a new dynasty seized power in 867 AD that would restore the empire's prestige, prosperity, and power. This was the Macedonian dynasty, a line of emperors who oversaw nearly 2 centuries of stability and expansion. For later generations, this period would be remembered as a Byzantine Renaissance. It began with Basil I, known as the Macedonian. Basil's origins were humble, born a peasant in the Balkans. Some claimed of Armenian or Slavic descent. By wit, charm, and ruthless ambition, he rose from stable boy to imperial bodyguard, then to co-emperor, and finally, through assassination of his patron Michael III, sole emperor in 867. His tale alone reflected one of Byzantium's enduring themes, that power could be seized by the most unlikely, and that emperors were forged as much by destiny as by blood. Basil established the dynasty that would reign for generations, and with it, he restored dignity to an empire cracked by internal disputes. His reign consolidated law and order at home, curbed the excesses of aristocratic elites, and patronized culture. He commissioned new codifications of law, refined court patronage, and laid foundations for one of Byzantium's most prosperous eras. Though his life ended violently, as it had begun, his dynasty endured, and the empire stabilized. But it was not only Basil. The Macedonian dynasty saw emperors of unusual competence. Through their steady rule, Byzantium regained initiative lost in the centuries of crisis. By the 10th century, Constantinople was again one of the world's great capitals, its population swelling, its harbors once more thronged with the wealth of distant lands. Historians refer to this time proudly as a Macedonian Renaissance, not only in empire and law but in art, learning, and faith. Monasteries flourished, preserving classical Greek texts that would centuries later filter into Renaissance Europe. The empire's artists produced some of the most exquisite mosaics ever seen, glowing in domes with gold and color, shimmering by lamplight. Frescoes, illuminated manuscripts, and sculpture thrived, blending the inheritance of Rome with Christian iconography. Orthodox Christianity itself spread beyond Byzantium's borders, carried by missionaries Cyril and Methodius into the Slavic world. Through their work, Slavic peoples embraced Christianity, and a foundation was laid for Orthodox identity across Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia. In this way, Byzantium extended its spiritual empire beyond its borders, shaping entire civilizations. But perhaps most importantly of all, Byzantium's armies revived. Under steady emperors, frontier defenses tightened, lost lands were reclaimed, and military energy flowed through the empire. Campaigns pushed back Arab forces. Victories in Crete and Cyprus restored Aegean dominance. The centuries-long humiliation after Manzikert had not yet come. Instead, this was the time when Byzantium once again brandished the sword of conquest. The dynasty's crown jewel came in the reign of Basil II, 976–1025, remembered forever as the Bulgar Slayer. Basil II was the epitome of a soldier emperor, disciplined, ruthless, and personally commanding his armies on campaign after campaign. Unlike emperors who wasted treasure on court luxury, Basil was austere, directing all resources to the military. He spent decades warring against the Bulgarians, a fierce people whose raiders haunted the Balkans. His wars were long, brutal struggles of fortress sieges and shifting alliances, yet Basil would not relent. He broke Bulgaria piece by piece until, at last, its kingdom was crushed and annexed. To intimidate his foes, he once ordered 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners blinded, sparing one man in every 100 with one eye to lead the rest home. Legend says their king died of shock seeing his maimed soldiers return, and Basil earned his fearsome epithet. Under Basil II, the empire stretched from the Adriatic to the Caucasus. For one glorious century, Byzantium ruled supreme over the Balkans, held much of Anatolia, extended sway deep into the Black Sea, and commanded seas with fleets unmatched. It was renewed, heirs again to Rome's dominion. And yet power carried seeds of danger. Basil II's empire was wide, but it depended on the strength of his leadership. He never married, leaving no direct heirs. When he died in 1025, Byzantium stood at its peak, yet his successors lacked his discipline. Nephews and relatives preferred palace intrigue to campaigns. Arrogant aristocrats clawed wealth from peasants. Gradually, the efficiency Basil had forged eroded. Still, the memory of the Macedonian Renaissance lingered like golden light. Constantinople dazzled foreigners. Crusaders from the Latin West, when they first saw it in future centuries, gasped at its walls, its palaces, its aqueducts glittering with mosaics, its markets spilling over with silks, spices, and treasures. To them, it seemed a vision of heaven itself. By the mid-11th century, Byzantium under Basil II's heirs reached its furthest zenith. But every empire's summit conceals the slopes of decline. For Byzantium, The looming threat came not from Bulgarians nor Arabs, but from a new power rising in Asia Minor, the Seljuk Turks. And within, corruption and weakness hollowed the Macedonian achievement. The Renaissance had been real, glorious, and brilliant, but it was also the last moment when Byzantium truly shone as the unrivaled master of its world. Ahead lay shocks from which it would never fully recover, battles lost, trust betrayed, and ultimately, catastrophe at the hands of supposed Christian allies. When Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire stood at the very height of its power. Its borders stretched across the Balkans, Armenia, and deep into Anatolia. Its armies were feared, its treasure chests full, its capital Constantinople the richest city in the known world. To foreign pilgrims gazing on its soaring domes and glittering mosaics, Byzantium seemed eternal. But within its gilded palaces and vast halls, corruption and complacency crept like rot beneath marble. The strong hand of Basil was gone, and with weak rulers at the helm, the empire began sliding down a slope from which it could not recover. The decades after Basil's death were marked by mismanagement. His successors, nephews and relatives, indulged in palace politics and court luxury, while neglecting the military machine Basil had so ruthlessly maintained. The bureaucracy bloated, aristocrats seized vast estates, and the once disciplined army weakened as generals appointed friends over professionals. Even the treasured peasants of Anatolia, the backbone of Basil's soldier-farmer system, were squeezed by taxation and decline, forcing many into dependence on local lords. Byzantium still looked powerful, but its foundations had begun to crumble. The great crack came in 1071, when Byzantine forces faced a new enemy in the east, the Seljuk Turks. Emerging from the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuks had adopted Islam and carved out a vast realm stretching into Persia and Anatolia. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a huge army against them, determined to crush the threat. But at the Battle of Manzikert, on the fields of eastern Anatolia, the Byzantines suffered catastrophe. Betrayal by allies, poor coordination, and the ferocity of the Seljuk horse archers led to total collapse. Romanos himself was captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. Though the emperor was released, the blow was fatal. Byzantium lost the core of Anatolia, the empire's breadbasket and main source of soldiers. Overnight, the empire's geography was rewritten, and Byzantium would never regain it fully. Manzikert scarred the Byzantine psyche. Anatolia, once their heartland, slipped away rapidly as Turkish tribes settled it, founding what would become the Sultanate of Rum. The empire's survival now hinged increasingly on its capital, fortified harbors, and dwindling Balkan lands. Byzantium, once conqueror, was falling into a defensive crouch. Out of desperation, emperors looked west. In 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing renewed Turkish assaults, appealed to the Pope and Western Christendom for aid. What he hoped for were mercenary bands of knights to reinforce Byzantium's ranks. What he received was an earthquake in world history, the First Crusade. Preachers in Europe rallied tens of thousands to march east, ostensibly to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. When these armies arrived in Constantinople, Byzantine officials were astonished by both their numbers and their fervor. For a time, Alexios managed the situation shrewdly. He ferried the armies into Anatolia, recaptured parts of western Asia Minor, and briefly stabilized Byzantine frontiers. For the moment, the Crusaders appeared useful allies. But beneath the surface, distrust festered. The Latins, as Western Europeans were called, despised the Byzantines as decadent and deceitful. The Byzantines regarded the Latins as unruly barbarians, brave on the battlefield but unpredictable and arrogant. While Crusaders pushed south, carving out new states in Syria and Palestine, the Byzantines worried they were as much a long-term threat as their foes. Suspicion poisoned relations, gradually turning shaky alliance into hostility. The Komnenian emperors Alexios I, John II, and Manuel I remained able rulers, and for a century they kept the empire afloat. Through careful diplomacy, limited reconquest, and exploitation of Crusader help, they sustained Byzantium past what might have been its death blow. Yet the price was dependence. Byzantium was no longer Rome's heir stretching across continents. It was becoming a middle power, entangled in the rivalries of larger forces around it. The climax of this mistrust came in 1204, in one of the darkest moments in all Byzantine history. The Fourth Crusade had been launched, but it went fatally off course. Its original goal had been Egypt, a Muslim stronghold, but Venetian merchants redirected the vast army toward Constantinople, partly to settle debts, partly to exploit rival claims to the throne. What followed was shocking even to contemporaries. Christian knights, armored and bearing the cross, stormed the greatest Christian city in the world. The walls of Constantinople, which had repelled Persian shahs, Arab caliphs, and Ottoman sultans to come, were breached not by Muslims but by fellow Christians. The Crusaders poured in, and for 3 days Constantinople endured looting, fire, and atrocity. Ancient relics were smashed or stolen, saints, shrines desecrated, priceless art and manuscripts destroyed or carried off to Western cathedrals. Horses were stabled inside Hagia Sophia itself, where Crusader soldiers drank from communion chalices. The impact was catastrophic. The Byzantine Empire was carved apart. A Latin empire, ruled by Western lords, was established in Constantinople. Byzantines retreated to successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, clinging to fragments of identity and hope. The city itself, once the richest in Europe, was gutted of treasures. The humiliation was total. To Greek Orthodox Byzantines, 1204 was a betrayal that never healed a proof that Latin Christians were not allies but oppressors. Though Byzantium would eventually reclaim Constantinople in 1261 under the Palaiologos dynasty, the empire had been permanently crippled. Much of its wealth was gone, its confidence shattered, its territories splintered. From then onward, Byzantium was a shadow of its former self, surviving more by inertia than vigor. The sack of 1204 was not the final fall, but it was an irreversible descent. If Basil II's reign had marked the high crest of Byzantine greatness, then 1204 was its shattering on the rocks, a catastrophe wrought not by infidels, but by those who called themselves fellow Christians. In 1261, after nearly 6 decades of humiliation under Latin occupation, the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople. Michael VII Palaiologos, a determined general from the Empire of Nicaea, marched back into the city, and the double-headed eagle was raised once again above Hagia Sophia. People wept and prayed in the streets. Constantinople was Roman once more. But the city they regained was not the dazzling queen of the Mediterranean that Crusaders had plundered. It was scarred, burned, and looted, its treasures stripped, its population thinned. Byzantium had survived, yes, but the empire that stepped back into Constantinople was a ghost of its former self. The Palaiologos dynasty would hold the throne for nearly 2 centuries, but their empire was fractured and frail. The Balkans were slipping into independence under Serbs, Bulgarians, and rising Slavic states. Anatolia, once the heartland, was almost entirely lost to Turkish beyliks. Economically, Byzantium had become dependent on Italian merchant republics like Venice and Genoa, who dominated trade through the Bosporus. The once mighty empire was little more than Constantinople itself, a handful of territories in Greece and scattered outposts. The proud Roman eagle was now just a bird in a cage. Meanwhile, further east, a new power had risen, one destined to end the story. The Ottoman Turks, under their Osmanli dynasty, began as one of the many Turkish states carved out of the ruins of the Seljuks, but they expanded relentlessly, conquering territory in Anatolia and pushing into the Balkans. By the 14th century, they were no longer raiders, they were empire builders. In 1453, the Ottomans would finish what Alp Arslan had begun at Manzikert 4 centuries earlier. The 14th century was marked by Byzantium's desperate attempts to play survival politics. Emperors begged for Western aid, proposing to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches to secure Latin support. Occasional crusading armies came, but never in enough strength or conviction to stop Ottoman expansion. To many Orthodox Byzantines, union with Rome was a bitter pill. They believed their emperors would rather betray the faith than save the city. And so, alienated from their own people and abandoned by their supposed allies, the emperors could only watch as Ottoman armies encircled them like a tightening noose. In 1451, maimed II, just 19 years old, became Sultan of the Ottomans. Ambitious, brilliant, and ruthless, Maimed was determined to do what no army in 1,000 years had achieved: overthrow Constantinople. He built a massive navy, constructed a fortress on the Bosporus to choke supplies, and, most terrifyingly, deployed a new kind of weapon: giant cannons, cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban, capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds straight into the ancient Theodosian walls. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos prepared for the end. A proud but weary man, he led a capital of perhaps only 50,000 people, a shadow compared to the city of 500,000 it had once been. The defenders numbered perhaps 7,000 soldiers, including a few hundred Genoese mercenaries. Against them, Maimed assembled perhaps 80,000 to 100,000 troops, janissaries, cavalry, and sailors, a storm against a garrison. Still, Constantine refused to abandon his post. To his men he swore, "I will not leave this city. I will live or die with Constantinople." In April of 1453, the Ottoman siege began. For weeks, cannons hammered the walls, the ground shaking with each impact. The Theodosian walls, triple walls that had repelled Persians, Arabs, and even earlier Turks, finally trembled under the thunder of gunpowder. Night after night, Byzantines scrambled to patch breaches with rubble, wood, and even household furniture. Priests paraded relics through the streets, begging divine mercy. Legends tell of processions carrying the icon of the Virgin Mary on the walls as chants filled the air. The Ottomans, too, threw everything into the fight. They dragged ships across land to bypass the chain boom that blocked the Golden Horn, shocking defenders with fleets suddenly appearing inside the harbor. Assaults came in wave after wave, repelled at great cost. For a moment it seemed Constantinople might hold once again, as it had for centuries, but Maimed's determination never wavered. On May 29th, after a final night of prayer within Hagia Sophia, Constantinople fell. At dawn, waves of janissaries stormed the broken walls. Constantine XI is said to have torn off his imperial regalia, plunging into battle as an ordinary soldier. His body was never definitively identified. Legend holds he became immortalized as the Marble Emperor, sleeping beneath the city, waiting for resurrection. But on that day, he died facing his enemy. The city was overrun. Maimed II, the 19-year-old conqueror, entered Hagia Sophia, ordering its conversion into a mosque. For Ottomans, it was the dawn of empire. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became their capital and would remain so for centuries. For Christendom, it was an earthquake. The last remnant of Rome, the empire that had survived for over 1,000 years after the fall of the West, was gone. The Roman Empire, born in the days of Augustus, had finally ended. The effects rippled across history. Greek refugees carrying manuscripts fled west to Italy, fueling the Renaissance with rediscovered classical knowledge. Orthodox Christianity survived, transplanted into Russia, Serbia, and the Balkans, which now saw themselves as heirs to Byzantium's mantle. And the Ottoman Empire surged to dominance, reshaping the balance of Europe and Asia for centuries. Byzantium had been more than a state. It had been the guardian of Rome's legacy, laws preserved, texts protected, faith defined. It had been a shield against endless invasions, holding the gates of Europe against Persians, Arabs, and Turks for centuries. For 1,123 years after Constantine founded Constantinople, the empire endured, transforming, surviving, sometimes triumphant, often battered, yet never fully destroyed until that May morning of 1453. The fall of Constantinople was not just an ending, it was also a torch's passing. The flame of Rome, carried east by Constantine, flickered for a millennium longer. When it finally died, it ignited anew in the Renaissance, in Orthodox tradition, and in the very idea of empire itself. The Byzantines had called themselves Romans. In truth, they were the last Romans. And with them, an ancient age passed into history.